Welcome to another episode of Love, Selling, Hate Sales. Today, I'm joined by Jordana Zeldin, who is a sales coach and trainer. She's the co-founder of the Practice Lab and founder of Spring Training with two eyes. Jordana, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
You're welcome. So, one of these concepts that I'm always fascinated by, I like to draw parallels between professional sports and sales because I think there are a lot of parallels. We're all elite performance, whatever. But one of the things that professional athletes do a lot of is practice, right? They are constantly honing their craft over and over and over again. Now, that's where the parallels with sales tends to break down a little bit because in sales, oftentimes, we get a new job, we get a list, maybe a phone book, maybe an access to a CRM, we get a pat on the back, a phone, and we go. So how can you make us more like professional athletes, Jordana?
Well, it's actually so interesting. I've never thought that there are all these parallels between the two, and then it really does break down in the process. We're such a metrics and results driven field and industry and profession, but the expectation is that we're going to achieve those results in absence of any process that is in any way connected to how every other discipline in the world, from sports to music or anything else, develops their skills. And that in itself is just a little crazy. And even though I'm now in a place where I focus so much on practice and talk about practice so much, it never fails to the gap between how in sales we think about learning something and then being able to do it never fails to astound me.
Oh, it's totally insane. And that's not so the analogy or the story that I told isn't a completely untrue story, right? So my first sales job, I was a sales intern at a radio station in Scottsdale. And it was a referral from my professor at Arizona State. He said, hey, you should go check it out. My friend's a GM. You need an internship anyway. I think you'd be good at sales. Okay, cool. So I show up. GM says, hey, Josh, nice to meet you. Hands me the white pages. For those who remember the white pages, says, here's your desk, here's the phone, and good luck. That was it.
Right. Well, so it's getting a little better, but I think industry-wide, that remains the status quo. And what's interesting is that, I came up in a sales training and coaching company before starting my own thing that was entirely practice-based. So this was a company that was already hip to the idea that deliberately practicing our sales skills, like every other discipline out there, makes us better. And though I had, a kind of I had not previously had any official coach training. I was a kind of like a player coach in my sales org and really got a lot from helping to empower and enable people to perform more effectively and to feel better. But my actual first coach training was in this very specific kind of coaching called practice coaching, where it's akin to how athletic coaches develop their reps. It's through a quick explanation, but really the power is in the demonstration and the iterative practice. So, in my work with sales teams at Spring Training, I just launched a program called the Practice Coaching Masterclass, where I help sales leaders to become more effective practice coaches. And then in the Practice Lab, that is the place where we break down the typical sales cycle of an AE, from disco to close into these practicable micro behaviors. And folks come together to get their reps in before they get on the phone with a prospect and screw everything up because they feel so uncomfortable trying something on for size that they had just learned.
Interesting. So I did a very brief stint as a pharma rep. And I would say that was the closest thing I ever got to real practice. It wasn't really in an ongoing fashion, but you fly out with a cohort of new hires to New Jersey. You stay there for a week. You get thrown into training for a bunch of time. You do a bunch of mock calls, a bunch of this, a bunch of that. I would say that was maybe the closest thing I ever experienced for practice in sales, but talk to us a little bit more about what practice looks like for salespeople. Because the only thing that's popping in my head is a mock call, right?
Right.
I'm sure it's more than that.
Well, it's so interesting because it's true. Like at best, all of the practicing happens on onboarding and training, and then like industry wide, and then like for some reason it never happens again. But what Jonathan, my co-founder, and I of the practice lab have really paid attention to is the way that every other discipline doesn't just like practice the whole thing of what they're doing. If they're learning the, a piano concerto, you don't just like do the concerto. If you're on a sports team, you don't just like play the game.
Right.
It's about really breaking it down into these smaller bite-sized pieces. So that's, that's how we approach it. We, in the curriculum and in the cohort, we start with the agenda and like, what does a great agenda look like? And what are the components that take an agenda from okay to really effective, right? To encouraging a transparent and open dialogue, to giving your prospect a way out if they feel like this is not for them. How do you do that? And so we start the cohort with practicing really effective agendas.
That's pretty great.
And then like the second week is about listening, like really attuning yourself to the 4 levels of effective listening. Because one of the most fascinating things that I've discovered through identifying how to practice listening, actually with the help of a guest facilitator, Chris Williams, who comes in for that session, is that how deeply you listen directly impacts the amount that the person you're listening to is willing to disclose.
Oh, wow. So there's a nice correlation there.
Well, if we're expecting, as sellers that prospects open up to us, right? Open up to a total stranger about their deep, dark challenges, like the way to encourage that, or one powerful way to encourage that, is through listening really attentively. Yeah. So that's something we practice.
Well, so practicing that, I know you have more steps to go through, but I think that's really important, right? We talk about listening and everyone says, well, we just need to listen better. And it's just like with an agenda. You can have agendas for your meetings, but nobody defines what that really means. So the listening one is super interesting to me. So recently I had a guest on the show who's blind, right? And he's in sales. So in my opinion, he's an expert listener because that's his vehicle, right? So I asked him a bunch of questions around like, listening. You have to be better at listening than anybody, right? If you don't have the visual cues that the next person has, listening is your superpower. And he went down that path. But I would love to hear from you. What are some of the key components to, 1, listening well, but 2, demonstrating to the person on the other side that you're listening well?
So this is really interesting. And you should talk to Chris Williams, who runs Listening Fest, who facilitates the session. But what he's done is he's broken it down into the 4 levels of listening, where at level 1, you are like distracted, looking around, not paying attention. Have you ever like had a conversation with someone who's like on their phone? They're like,
yes, it's very frustrating.
How does that make you as the person speaking feel, right? Small. Like angry, shut down. Yeah, exactly. And so what we do is we actually kind of work through an exercise where we are progressing through the 4 levels of listening, where at level 4, not only is your attention like deeply focused on the person that you're talking to, but you're, even when inspired to, like asking a question or making a comment that deepens their understanding. You're reading between the lines, right?
Sure.
And that ideally is what you want to be doing when you're, say, deep in discovery, right? Shifting perspective by the attentiveness and your ability to bring to light things that maybe they hadn't considered before. And what's really cool about this exercise is that people often say, oh my God, I realize like so often on my sales calls, I'm a level 1 or a level 2 listener, right? And they feel that. And they also feel what it feels like to be listened to at that level and how shitty it feels and how untrusting it feels, right?
Right.
And then when they have that experience of ratcheting it up and developing that awareness of what it feels like, both as the listener and the person on the receiving end, they're then able to take that feeling and bring it right into their next discovery calls for greater effectiveness and more disclosure. And it is cool.
It's super cool. And it's funny because, that experience that everyone can relate to of being on the other side of someone not listening to you is so painful, to the point now where I'm fascinated by public speakers, but maybe because I'm an aspiring public speaker and I think it's really cool. But they even make jokes now at the top of their session about people scrolling on their phones or this and that, just to see who's listening to them. Actually, some people won't even pop their heads up at the joke that's being made at their expense. Right. So it's so crazy.
Well, what's interesting too is that so often like discovery is treated as like a qualification checklist. So part of the, right? Like it's just like, it's like you're at the doctor's office, right? And it's like this take rather than this give. So the few sessions that we have around deeper discovery is really meant to kind of flip the script there and to use discovery as a moment in a conversation that can deepen understanding, give understanding, and build relationship for greater trust.
So I'd love to get your take on this, because that flipping the script to create greater discovery, I personally think is huge, right? I think it sets you apart from your competition, other sellers, how you run your process. And I have this feeling that the quality of the questions you ask almost set you up for success more than, and I don't mean set you up for, what am I trying to say? The quality of the questions that you ask almost show that you know your stuff more than telling them that you know your stuff.
1,000,000%. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I get weird looks sometimes when I say that. Like, I don't need to say anything. I'm just going to ask questions that let them know I know what I'm talking about.
That is so true. And I think that's actually in some ways no more true. Well, in like quote unquote discovery, but also, you know, like the only time that you're allowed to ask questions is not in discovery. Like the entire sales conversation can and should be a dialogue, you know, and one of the kind of skills that we work on in the lab, we call tie down questions and setup statements. And the idea is that before you introduce a feature in your pitch, if you feel like you didn't get the information that you needed in quote unquote discovery to determine if what you're about to bring up is relevant, there's an opportunity to ask a really effective question right there.
Yeah.
Or to make a strong transition. Say, earlier, you mentioned this. I'm curious, you know, how is this functioning on your team today? Yeah. And based on what they share, you can say, okay, I think this might be interesting for you. Go into your feature, but then don't just end with your pitch and then, what questions do you have, right? Or like nothing. What's an effective question that you can ask following your explanation of that statement to get them to imagine how that would function in their organization, to get them to think more deeply? So questioning is a skill that can be employed at every stage in the sales conversation, we feel.
What questions do you have is maybe my biggest pet peeve, period. Like, no one's going to answer that. No one's sitting there watching you or listening to your pitch, writing down a list of questions that they're just dying to share with you. It's your job to draw them in and be very strategic with that question and put yourself in their world and think about, you need to be able to predict the future. That's the bottom line. Like, that's what questioning is to me in a lot of cases. Like, you should be good enough that you can predict the future about what they're thinking and ask them that question so they don't have to ask it.
Well, also, I think in discovery too, like, people understand that they need to ask questions, but they're not really sure exactly what questions they should be asking. And so part of what we do in the lab is, in the exercise on these tie down questions, which are the questions that you ask to engage your prospect following the description of the feature. Like, we encourage sellers in lab to create a bank of questions that are working for them in practice, and their partner is able to say, hey, that question felt good. Or actually that question felt like it's serving you more than it's serving me. You know, those questions that are like, hey, how much money could you imagine saving if you employed our solution today? Versus, you know, like, no, those are not tie down questions that serve the buyer in the conversation, right? But I'm curious, like, who on your team do you imagine would benefit from this feature that I've just described? That's a question that invites more participation. That would be a really good tie down question.
What are your thoughts when you're selling to a committee, which oftentimes you are, especially if you're in the room, and even more so now on Zoom calls, at addressing specific people with those tie down questions versus opening it up to the room?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That's not one that's come up. You know, I guess it depends. Like, you have to be pretty clear and dialed in on who's playing what role, so if you have a technical person in the room, along with, let's say, someone who's more client focused, if you're walking through a technical part of the product, that might be an opportunity to, do a kind of setup statement and say, hey, I'm curious, like, there's this one aspect of our product, like, how are you doing this today? So-and-so.
Right.
And then they tell you, and you can say, okay, so let me just direct you here.
Yeah.
Walk them through that aspect of the feature, and then follow it up with a question, right? And it can be, how different is this than what you're doing now? It could be who on your team could benefit from this. It could be, I'm curious, like, as you're walking through this, what thoughts are coming to mind? More of an open-ended question.
Right.
But those are all, it's vital that we practice those. Those are not the kinds of questions that early on you can just come up with on the fly and be effective. But if you're able to identify questions that feel good for you, that have been vetted by your practice partner, and they can say, yeah, that actually feels like a genuinely curious question that's going to deepen my understanding of what you're showing me. You can write those down in your sheet. You can practice them in the lab. You can practice them on yourself, so that when you get on the phone with your prospects, it comes out naturally, right?
Yeah.
It feels good. It sounds good.
Yeah. Because a lot of stuff that is good sales, frankly, is uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
It should be.
And it should be. It can be very hard if you feel so uncomfortable with the skill that you're trying to execute, that you're not only trying to create that healthy tension, but fumbling through your ability to do it at all. Right.
Completely.
So that is a big, big benefit of getting your reps in, getting your stumbliness and your awkwardness and your at-bats in before the pressure is on, so that you can deliver really smoothly on your calls with prospects.
Well, I'm super curious because, one of the things that I always struggle with when it comes to like mock calls in, we'll call it a practice setting, is the person playing the prospect always does such a shitty job, right? Like, it's never reality. To me, you always swing in one of two directions. You swing in the direction of just keep the conversation going, play nice, and, placate the person that's practicing, or you swing way too far the other way and you're a complete jerk. And it's just like objection, just to see like how they objection handle. So talk to me about practice in your world. Like, how do we make it more usable, more, I don't know, like more like the real world in practice, or is that not the goal at all? Right. Maybe I'm thinking about this all wrong.
Well, I don't think you're thinking about it all wrong. I mean, what I'd say is that when I teach managers on sales teams how to practice coach, I've always found it to be really effective for them to position the practice as preparation in the same way that an athlete preps for a game. So you're not just living in this fantasy world to role play for role play's sake, but you really ground it in the person you're coaching's reality. And you say, I'm curious, like, Josh, what meetings do you have coming up this week? Okay. Who is it with? Great. Let's use this session to prepare for that upcoming meeting. So suddenly it feels like there's a point, right? Just beyond the futility of repetition. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when, like in the practice lab, sellers are from different organizations. So doing an exercise around, let's say, like a deep discovery exercise would be really hard to do effectively if you were in the context of role play. So for those labs, we take sellers out of the context of selling and into the realm of real conversation.
Okay.
So we have folks playing, the seller or the questioner, the discoverer, ask their partner about a change they want to make in their life, like a real one, or about a purchase that they're thinking about making.
Okay.
And then they're able to use the various aspects that we teach that make for effective discovery around making sure that you're getting a solid sense of where your partner is at, right? Where they want to be, why they have not taken action to date, what the impact would be if they do nothing, you're given some guidance about the areas that you need to inquire about, but you're doing so in the context of a real conversation with a real person who actually has a real change they want to make. And that's where that shift in discovery as a checklist of questions on a sheet and discovery as like genuinely curiosity fueled happens for people.
I find this completely fascinating because we're going to come back to my sports analogy because I'm dense and that's how I think. So
yeah, cool.
My son right now is being coached by a former major leaguer, right?
Whoa,
and
cool.
Right. And up until this point, I coached him, dad coach, right? The T-ball, coach pitch, all this kind of stuff. And dad coach just does what dad coach does, right? He hits him some grounders. He tells him to throw to first base, introduces a few scenarios. It is what it is, right? It's practice for dad coach. Well, former Major League Baseball player coach, nothing is happening at game speed. It's all these micro lessons that build foundations on one another, right? There's these little things, right? Like you would never do that in a game. You would never do that in a game, but all of them put together, you never see them practice at game speed, I guess is my point. No. Whereas we do these mock calls and we like try to mock up game speed. That's not the intention. What you're talking about is getting comfortable in like situations, not in this mock call, right? Like these little micro things that build up a foundation that you can use.
I am so glad you brought that to light for so many reasons. So what you're describing is called deep and deliberate practice. And the science of behavioral change and skill development, as well as neuroscience, backs everything that you just said, which is that if you go slowly and deeply, making mistakes, stumbling, doubling back and making corrections, that is where you most effectively develop your neurological circuitry, because it's not about in practice proving that you can play the game, right?
Right. Exactly.
It's about, building the awareness and muddling through so that when things speed up, you've got more skill. And that's exactly what we encourage in the lab. So in our objection handling lab, we have a 6-step framework that we teach, but we're really encouraging people to muddle through. It starts when you receive an objection by welcoming it and actually connecting with a beat of gratitude that your prospect told you something that's on their mind rather than ghosting you. So it's not just like, okay, I completely understand. It's like, hey, I really, really appreciate the transparency, or I'm really glad you brought that up.
Right.
Step 1. Okay.
Right.
Step 2, this one can be challenging. We empathize, but not validate. And that is a very tough line for people to toe. And I'll give you a demonstration. And this was one of the chief. Okay. So someone, and this is going to be a bit of an exaggerated version, but let's say someone says, we're going to go with your competitor. Your price is too high, right? Validating an example might be, you're right. Our price is too high, right? An empathetic statement might be, it would make sense that as you're evaluating different options, price is going to be something you're thinking about.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a tough line to toe, right? Or we're going to go with a competitor. I'm trying to think of what a validation of that, but an empathizing statement would be, I've got to say, I'm really glad to hear that as you're thinking so seriously about finding a vendor, you're talking to a lot of different people. Like it's rewarding. It's rewarding what they're saying in the context of the buying decision. And that is really hard to come up with on the fly. And that is a step in the practice lab where we're like, guys, take your time, muddle through, like try a couple at bats, see which one feels right. And then when you get to one and your partner says, yeah, that one actually felt real, like write it down, right? And then use that to practice and refine and then turn it into game speed when you're on the phone with your prospects. But the time in the lab is to slow down and build awareness.
That's so great. I could see myself being a total jerk in that situation. Oh, so this deal's actually real. You're talking to other people, not just me.
Yeah. It's tricky. You don't want to go overly falsely, complimentary in that moment, but it's just taking a beat because with objection handling, one of the things that people often think somehow is that when they get an objection, as long as they have a really friggin' good counterpunch, that's the moment to bring it up. And then somehow they're going to magically change their prospect's perspective. Right. But at the moment of objection, not going to happen. Resistance is high, receptivity to new ideas is low. No. So when we handle an objection, we're not just trying to shift their mind, we're trying to take down the temperature of their resistance so that they're more receptive to what we have to say. And that requires some kid gloves early on in the process. A little bit. You've got it. Yeah.
Man, this is awesome. Let's shift gears just a little bit since we're coming up on time here. So where can the audience find you? Where can they find more about the practice lab, about spring training? Like, what do you want them to know? What are the key takeaways?
Okay, here's what I want them to know. And what's become really clear to me and my co-founder of the lab in the last couple of weeks, which is the practice lab is not for everybody. It is so not for everyone. Like what we've come to learn about this cohort is that because this is a peer-to-peer practice-based community, yes, facilitated by us, that the quality of the partners, their genuine growth mindset, like mindedness, their humility, their generosity, like their comfort with stumbling and being a little awkward en route to learning something is vital for the success of everyone's improvement in their abilities. So I say that because we just wrapped the last cohort, the Q1 cohort. The next time we're going to be opening our doors is in Q3. We're soon going to be opening up applications both to individuals and teams. And for anyone who is curious about this approach, that feels like a really important disclaimer. And if based on what I've shared, you're like, yes, I'm humble. Yes, I'm growth minded. Yes, I'm generous, right? Yes, I'm willing to screw up and face palm in front of a partner, then I would encourage you to apply. And you can do that at thepracticelab.co. There's a wait list right now, but we'll be opening up applications soon.
Very good. Well, Jordana, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure having you. We might have to do it again because it seems like there's a lot more to unpack here that my little brain's trying to wrap my head around.
30 minutes is not enough.
No, not to talk about practice, man. In the wise words of Allen Iverson. All right. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much.